Wednesday, 1/24/18, and this is Cis-332 database SQL. It's more about course materials, it's more about data and information, and we talk about information systems. We're still in section 1, and it is week number 2, day 3 for the course. Alright? Makes sense. Okay, so let's move to the page. You should be able to, this is still up here from the other class, don't worry about that. You should be able to log into both servers, and you should be able to locate them either using a local private address or a global public address. If you're outside of the classroom area, you have to use the public address. If you're in the classroom, you can use the private address. If you're logging in from some terminal services, you should be able to use SSH, username, @ and then give the host. The host be the public IP address. We don't have a specific host name, but that's the computer host. So, depending on which server you're logging into. We went over today, we reviewed access to MySQL on Work Server 1, and it's a little bit different on Work Server 2. And on Work Server 2, we do not have individual accounts. We have one general account for you to log into. Okay, some theory items. We spend quite a bit of time in the course talking about the design of databases, rightfully so. It's really important in order for us to take the advantages of why we use a database. We want the data to be accurate. We want to have good access. We want to be able to manage the database, back it up, add, take out information, so forth. And we also want to be able to secure the database. Why we would use a relational database. So let's go back and talk a little bit about this data. Data is represented typically in a table. We call it an entity that has information that relates to the entity. So if the entity is customers for your business, then this information about the customer should relate to the entity. That information is put in attributes, or often called fields. Those attributes must specifically define the entity. You don't want attributes that don't directly define the entity. We'll learn later on why. When we group a bunch of attributes together, we get a tuple, but more often called records. Represent the attributes are in the table. We always need an attribute that would be the primary key, a unique attribute that identifies each record. So we can identify each record. Alright. Let's take a look at the database from this top-down view. In databases nowadays, we have the users. We have this user view, typically through a browser, using HTML, a web server, and PHP programming. So in terms of who's using the database, we have this group of users, and we're going to talk more specifically about their views of how they see the data depending on how they're accessing it. Okay, now this is interesting for most people. I have up here programmers. Most people think the programming would be down deep in here of the database. Well, there is programming down here too, but there's also programming up here, which would be considered the back end, where they're programming PHP and the back end of the web servers to allow users to access what they need. In the middle, we have a whole layer, a logical layer. And that layer, we're going to split that up a little bit as we go along. That's where we logically look at the tables or attributes here, and then the information in there. So let me draw that out a little bit. So we have a table, and then we have the attributes, and then as we fill in the information in here, we have the records. Okay? People that work in this group, so we have database managers, administrators, CIO. And it's kind of in that order. The CIO is responsible for all the information, so he or she would be the bottom line if anything went wrong. The database administrator administers the work, and the manager would be more like the person who gets the work done. The manager would deal with the programmers and the designers and so forth. It ends up here. Somewhere stored physically. Then I draw an engine here. This would be like we're using MySQL. So we use syntax and so forth to talk to it here. It actually writes the data on the drive and then allows us to take that data off of the drive and move it back up into the hierarchy. More about these later. So, a little bit more SQL. So, we're going to do a lot of work in the course with design, building a logical model, and then we let the SQL manage it physically on the drive. So we have sort of these layers. Okay? In SQL, we want to be able to apply your skill. And so these are some of the commands. So far we should be able to manage. We should be able to use the use command, describe, show tables, select information from the tables. Okay. And then be able to use that in order to manage information in the tables. In the class, we'll talk about working with the items online too. Alright? So, we'll continue the process of the easiest way to show you a lot of the theory and how this is done, and then slowly applying all that theory with the SQL statements. We have online material to learn that, and then we'll have in class, we'll be doing some work in class. That's it.